Welcome to Anoya Center for Marine Science Talk. We are more than happy to be bringing you these talks and thrilled that you've joined us. And we do want to see the continued support for these science talks. These incredible people are giving of their time, and the Anoya Center wants to be sure to continue to bring speakers from around the world, and such as Sophie Warowski and others. So if you would like to, please, we ask a $10 donation if you are able. Many of you are already great supporters of the Anoya Center, and I'm happy to see all of you here. So let's dive in. I met Sophie through the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito. And I've known for a long time that one of the things about the Marine Mammal Center here in San Francisco is that they do a lot of work on elephant seals. And elephant seals are very similar to Hawaiian monk seals. So much has been learned about the Hawaiian monk seal by all the work that the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito has been doing over the years with elephant seals. So that's a kind of cool thing that I learned as a volunteer with the Marine Mammal Center. I've never seen a monk seal. I have seen pictures of them, and I think they're incredibly beautiful creatures. And when you see an elephant seal resting on the beach, now's the time that we get the pups that are kind of rolling off the rookeries. Moms, the adults have left pretty much, and the youngsters are now hanging out together and will start to forage out there into the world. So when you see an elephant seal on the beach, think of the Hawaiian monk seals that are benefiting from the research and whatnot that have been done on the elephant seals here in California. So I met Sophie in person, and Dave, her partner, who's over there in Hawaii with her, through the Marine Mammal Center. And Sophie is from Nova Scotia, the east coast of Canada, and studied there marine biology, and then moved on to study in Rhode Island, and then headed west, like many people do, and west until she got to California. Spent quite a few years, 7 years, as a vet tech and intern at the Marine Mammal Center, and had lots of hats to wear there, as they do. And then finally has gone the further distance west over to Hawaii, and that's where she's joining us from tonight. So welcome, Sophie, and I will let you have the mic and the screen, and thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks so much for the intro, Sarah, and really happy to be here. It's really nice to see some fresh faces, to be able to talk with a familiar community too, having worked with the Marine Mammal Center and worked with the Anoya Center before. I have to apologize too for some background noise, but my background noise is going to be occasional planes coming through. So our hospital was strategically built next to an airport because we want to be able to bring animals in from all the different islands, but then we do have that the background of planes coming in and out overhead. So every once in a while, I might just have to pause for a moment to just let the plane pass over. Here, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, so like Sarah mentioned, just wanted to give you guys, or give everyone an introduction to the Marine Mammal Center's work on Hawaiian monk seals specifically. So I know probably many of you are familiar with the Marine Mammal Center's work in Sausalito, California, especially, but we do also operate this hospital out on the big island of Hawaii that's purpose-built to care for Hawaiian monk seals. And it's the newest facility as part of the Marine Mammal Center. So we do have multiple sites in California that you may or may not be familiar with: the San Luis Obispo site, the Monterey Bay site, our folks in Fort Bragg that also support operations in the northern part of the range. And then the Hawaii hospital was actually built in 2014 to be able to help care for Hawaiian monk seals specifically. And that was really built And the Marine Mammal Center was brought over to lead that effort because of the nearly 40 years of experience working with all of the other animals. And like Sarah mentioned, with elephant seals being similarly related on the evolutionary tree to Hawaiian monk seals, there was a lot to be learned or had already been learned in caring for the marine mammals in California. So this hospital was built in Hawaii based on the experience of caring for the animals in California and then taking that knowledge and applying it to Hawaiian monk seals. So I won't talk a whole lot about the California operations. I know you've had other talks from the experts at the center there. And I will just dive right into more Hawaii specific operations and talk about monk seals. And Sarah, you're right, they are very cute and beautiful animals, very crafty as well. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with gray seals, but they have a little extra sass in them compared to an elephant seal, as I learned just working with them. And then this is their Hawaiian name, which means roughly translates to dog that runs in rough water. Well, very cool species of seal. They are endemic to Hawaii, and they are one of only two endemic mammals to the Hawaiian archipelago. So it's the Hawaiian monk seal, and then there is the Hawaiian hoary bat is the only other mammal that's endemic out here. Terrestrial anyways. There's certainly lots of cetaceans that travel through these waters. So just a little bit about the hospital itself. The name of the hospital is Keikaiola, and that translates to the healing sea. So again, it was purpose-built for long-term care of Hawaiian monk seals specifically, and it opened in 2014. And it was really established in partnership with NOAA Fisheries and their Hawaiian monk seal research program that has been in operation for several decades, looking specifically at this endangered population of monk seals. And they've done a significant amount of research and identified that one of the threats to Hawaiian monk seals was poor juvenile survivorship. So they thought, okay, what else can we do to potentially increase survivorship for these younger animals? And the thought was, hey, what if we rehabilitate them, really boost them up from that young pup age and give them kind of an extra chance to gain body condition and then bring them back to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So that was kind of the goal in building this hospital, is we could use rehabilitation as a tool to try to help support the population and support them at this critical life stage where they weren't really making it. So there's an estimate of about 1,400 Hawaiian monk seals across the Hawaiian archipelago. And so they're the only tropical seal left in the world, and they're found across this archipelago, and it's actually very large. So if you put the big island of Hawaii down at the bottom of Texas, the furthest reach of the archipelago would actually reach up to northern Washington, Seattle area. So it's quite a long stretch. And that being said, you do have animals that travel the entire length of this archipelago, which is pretty impressive, but that we can roughly split the population into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands here on the left, which are much more remote, have few people that live there. There's a few project personnel or fish and wildlife staff that operate some of the marine reserves in those areas and are conducting some research and projects. But in general, there's very little human activity up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and that's where the majority of the Hawaiian monk seal population lives, about 1,100 of those 1,400. And then you have the main Hawaiian Islands, which have about 300 to 400 individuals that primarily live within those islands. So they cross over with human activities at a much higher rate. There's a lot of people in the main Hawaiian Islands, especially the island of Oahu. That's where the majority of the human population lives. So you get a lot of activity there, and you'll see different interactions between monk seals and people that occur within the main Hawaiian Islands. But you do, while there is a fair amount of site fidelity for this species, they tend to kind of live in around one particular area. So on the big island of Hawaii specifically, we have about 10 monk seals that live here most of the time that we see all year round. But we do have movement of animals across the archipelago. And last year, or just a few months ago, sorry, there was one individual that swam from Curie, which is all the way at that northern edge, all the way over to Oahu. So stretching most of the archipelago, and it was pretty exciting and impressive to see. So definitely you will get movement of seals across the archipelago as well. Okay, I didn't miss a slide, sorry. I just wanted to give a little bit of background information about monk seals in general, since they don't go anywhere else in the world. They're just found here, so a little less familiar to you probably. Mostly solitary animals, so in general, we'll see when you see them haul out, they're generally by themselves. You don't see those groupings like California sea lions or even elephant seals where you see them all together. Hawaiian monk seals tend to want to be on their own unless they're younger individuals, then you'll see them interacting more together with other Hawaiian monk seals. They have a rough lifespan of about 25 to 30 years, and they start to reproduce at about 5 to 10 years of age. They are generalist feeders in general, so they feed on a whole variety of different items in and around the reefs here. They tend to forage near or at the sea floor, so not so much in the water column, and they generally are pretty shallow divers, so not stretching down much more than 300 feet, so not like their elephant seal cousins. They don't do those deep dives. They tend to be shallower, shorter duration dives, roughly 6 to 8 minutes. And there are different threats for this particular species, depending on which part of the archipelago you're looking at. So if we're looking at the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, they face a different threats in general. Food limitation is one of the actual threats for this particular species. And that's believed, like, over time, as this population has declined, there are fewer and fewer of them, and then other apex predators have been flourishing. So they actually have a hard time competing for some of those prey items because there are a lot of apex predators in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. They don't have that same kind of fishing pressure that occurs in the main Hawaiian Islands that starts to kind of drop those apex predators down. So there is a lot of competition in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and that's part of the reason we see this poor juvenile survivorship. They have to get through this stage where they're learning how to forage, but also compete with all of these other apex predators. Shark predation is another threat in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So part of the large number of apex predators is species of sharks, and that's particularly dangerous for the younger animals, the pups and the juveniles, as they're just learning their environment, or if they're just too close to the water's edge. It's primarily Galapagos sharks that will prey on the Hawaiian monk seals. So we do see some shark predation that will impact the population. And despite the fact that these are really remote islands, there is a lot of ocean trash that accumulates in those islands, and they do cause entanglements. So there has been loss of some Hawaiian monk seals from entanglement in some of that ocean trash, and there's very few people there to be able to respond to any of those entanglements. So very little that we can do to mitigate those kinds of activities unless there's research personnel or fish and wildlife personnel in the area that can respond to those animals. Male seal aggression is another one. So the male Hawaiian monk seals can be fairly aggressive, especially towards younger animals or towards the females, especially during the mating season. So think sea otter-like. So they can really go after the females and cause some pretty severe trauma sometimes. And it tends to be specific males, so it's not all males. But occasionally you will have a male like that will cause mortality of other monk seals. And then loss of habitat is another one. So a lot of these smaller islands are pretty tiny. Like, it's a bit more of just a sand spit in the ocean. And so things like sea level rise or climate change and increased storms causing more erosion have actually resulted in the loss of significant amounts of rookery areas or beaches in some of these smaller islands especially. So loss of habitat is certainly a threat there. And then if we move to the main Hawaiian Islands, the majority of the threats to the population are actually human activity related. And I forgot to mention in my earlier slide, we are actually seeing a bit of an upward trend in the population in Hawaiian monk seals. So it was in decline for the last 40, 50 years or so. And then in the last 10, there's been about a 2% increase in the population every year, rough estimate, which is great news. And the majority of that has been within the main Hawaiian Islands. And some of that thought is because there's been so much fishing pressure from human activities that again has decreased that apex predator and left more of the smaller, lower trophic level prey items for those monk seals. And we're actually seeing them do fairly well. But it does mean that as there's more monk seals in the main Hawaiian Islands, that they are coming into contact with people more. So we do see a number of fisheries interactions that will lead to mortality. So sometimes you'll have younger animals, especially drown in nets. They will swallow fishing gear, or they'll learn to prey on like long lines, or there's a lot of just recreational fishers in the area on the shorelines. And then the monk seals will pick up on that activity and look for an easy meal and interact with fishing gear, sometimes swallowing the gear, which is very dangerous for them as well. So I mentioned entanglement in fishing nets, but also entanglement in just ocean trash, again, is a concern in the main Hawaiian Islands. And then toxoplasmosis is another concern, and that one's an emerging threat. It's a disease that in the last 10 years has started to cause more and more mortality of Hawaiian monk seals. The numbers are still fairly low, but in a population of only 1,400 individuals, it's still significant. So it's less than 20 individuals have died of this disease, but it is a concern. And if you haven't heard of it, it's a parasite that's transmitted through the feces of cats. And there are a large number of feral cats in the main Hawaiian Islands that are probably very, very likely the source of this parasite. And it's not something that the Hawaiian monk seals have evolved to be able to have any kind of protective immunity, natural immunity to this parasite. So when they encounter it, they actually get very, very sick, and it often leads to mortality. And then there have been some negative human seal interactions and intentional killings in particular communities on particular islands. So that's another cause of mortality in the main Hawaiian Islands that is getting some attention and some focus in the last few years.
I'm loving hearing the Hawaiian birds in the background.
Oh, good. They are quite lovely. Well, there are a lot of not endemic birds here as well, but that's a whole different talk. So just some of the conservation efforts that have been in place for this particular species, there's been a lot of them, and it's a really wonderful example of a species that's had some resources devoted to it, and where we're actually starting to see this increase in the population. And so some of these mitigation efforts have been attributed to that increase in the population. So some of the things that are in place is the Hawaiian monk seal research program actually puts out summer field camps up on the Hawaiian archipelago. So they actually have staff that will stay up there for 3 to 4 months at a time. And that has allowed for a really robust data set about the population. So looking at all of the new pups that have been born, being able to tag those individuals to track them over time. So they have this whole sequential data set over the last several decades that you can look at and see, the individuals that were born, when they were born, how they survived, some of their movements as well, because they'll have these campers that are out basically tracking individual members of the population and gathering that data set. Also conducting other field projects. And another benefit of having those field campers out in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands is they can actually respond to entanglements and do some of those mitigations. So if they find a monk seal that's entangled, they can respond and free that seal. So resulting in less deaths there as well. It's also one of the only wild mammal species that has a vaccination program in place. So because this is a very isolated population of seals, they're more susceptible to potential viruses and other diseases coming from the outside. And we know there's so much movement of people and other animals coming in and out of Hawaii, this was deemed to be a significant enough threat, especially for a particular virus called phocine distemper virus. So that's one particular virus that has caused mass mortalities in other populations of seals. And so this program actually instigated a vaccination program where they were able to look at using a canine distemper vaccine, which is very similar. That virus is very similar to this phocine distemper virus. And they're actually vaccinating seals throughout the Hawaiian archipelago to try to give them some protection in case this virus does show up in the archipelago. Then this other thing is the focus of our work is the Rehabilitation Hospital. So again, looking at that particular threat of poor juvenile survivorship, but also we can respond and care for any monk seal that is sick across the archipelago. We can bring them here for care and then improve their chances of survival long-term. And then the establishment of marine protected areas and habitat restoration, something that we're all, I think, pretty familiar with as being a really positive way to help protect these species. And then there's a strong education component here, especially in the main Hawaiian Islands, where so many of the deaths are related to human activities. So we have these island-wide response networks. We, the Marine Mammal Center, basically we do response for the Big Island, and we are about to take on the island of Maui as well, but we have other partner organizations that cover some of the other islands. And we respond to monk seals within those islands to care for them. There's something called the Barbless Hook Project. So educating fishermen, trying to use hooks that are less traumatic if seal does happen to ingest one. Just general education and outreach about monk seals and the threats that they face and the way our activities are impacting them, of course. Providing those resources for the public. Signage on the beach is another important way of reaching people. So that's just kind of some of the general mitigation methods. And then for us, the hospital, I just wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into some of the things that we do, talk a little bit about some of our patients and some of their stories. Does anyone have any questions so far? I feel like I've been talking at you. All right. Just keep going. So again, the hospital opened in July 2014, and so far we've taken in 39 monk seal patients, which doesn't necessarily sound like that much, but it's actually roughly 2 to 3% of the population. And it's with all of those conservation efforts that we just talked about, it's estimated that 30% of the monk seals that are alive today are alive because of those efforts. So not only rehabilitation, but all of those other mitigation efforts that have been put into place to help protect this species, which is a pretty significant portion of the population. This is just a rough breakdown of the number of monk seals that we typically see in a year. So significantly lower than our California hospital, but again, still impactful when you're looking at this small population size. So the most we ever had in a year is 9 so far. And I apologize, I don't have the 2021 numbers up here, but it was 3 animals last year as well. And again, we work with a whole number of different partners across the Hawaiian archipelago. I won't go into detail there, but our hospital, as well as the animal care program, we do response across the islands, like I mentioned, as well as school and youth programs to continue some of those conservation efforts that we talked about before. We have a Hawaii specific education program that's targeted at grade 4 youth. So getting into schools and getting that message out to the youth and getting them involved in Hawaiian monk seal conservation has been really important, especially for these communities where we have different, it's very diverse here compared to some other areas. So we're looking at Native Hawaiians, other Polynesian communities, as well as our visitors to Hawaii. So having those robust school and youth programs are really important. And there's a number of online resources too. If anyone's interested, feel free to to look at the Marine Mammal Center website. There's actually a virtual tour of the Hawaii facility as well, if you want to take a deeper dive into any of this. So I encourage you to go to the Marine Mammal Center website if you want more information on those things. Response specifically for Hawaii is actually quite different than what we would normally associate it with in California. So the majority of our response activities are actually centered around perfectly healthy monk seals. And it's basically people going out and doing outreach and protecting these species because the beaches are so heavily trafficked in the main Hawaiian Islands. There's a lot of disturbance. And monk seals blend in so well with the lava rock, and it's so easy for people to get really close and disturb them, especially when they're trying to rest and really conserve their energy. Mom and pup pairs are especially of concern. Like anywhere else, you want to make sure that you're preserving that bond between the mom and a pup and allowing them the space to just be normal seals. So a lot of what we do out in Hawaii is actually send our volunteers out to, we call it seal sit, affectionately termed seal sitting, but basically establishing the zone around those Hawaiian monk seals, placing signs out and sitting with those seals and trying to mitigate some of those human interactions to allow them time to rest, make sure they're not getting harassed, and then share that monk seal story. And then there's animal care, which is very similar to what we do in Sausalito, but specific to Hawaiian monk seals. But that same delicious herring that we feed to our patients in California is what we're feeding to these monk seals here. And that's primarily because it's a really nutritious, high fat fish, and we want to get them that high calorie food so that they can gain weight in a substantial way. So I just wanted to dive into a few patient stories, if you'll indulge me on that one. But does anybody have any questions?
I did see a question in the chat, and I think I just hesitated because I think you are getting into to answering some of these questions. But Andrew Jordan is asking, did you go into monk seal habitat and the like, and what makes Hawaiian monk seals unique? So there's kind of two questions, and then anyway, the kind of twofold, like their habitat, like I think you've been talking about that, but like are they similar to elephant seals in that they haul out? And anyway, I bet you're going to get into some of that, and then what makes them unique, which I think almost everything about them in my mind is unique because they're in warm water, which is to me difficult to wrap my head around. But Andrew, also feel free to pop in and pose your question. If you like, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask that question if I didn't cover it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I was planning to kind of dive into some of the more specific patient stories, so I wasn't going to touch on as much of the natural history, so we can pause and definitely talk a little bit more about that. But like you mentioned, Sarah, like we were talking about before, it is the only tropical seal, and they are in this significantly warmer water. And it still amazes me how much blubber some of these seals still have, and they just lay it out in the sun, baking and warming themselves. And I don't understand how they don't just overheat, instantly. It's so impressive, but it just is a reminder of, what a good conductor water is and how much they lose heat. So they're spending a significant amount of time in the water still, and that blubber layer is still that main way of those seals keeping warm when they're in that aquatic environment. But you're right, we do see them haul out for significant periods of time. It's an important resting period for them to be able to regain that energy. And they are foraging in this really neat environment. Like we're looking at a coral reef, and there's a whole variety of different prey items that are available to them. So they are more generalist eaters. They're not targeting big schools of like herring or sardines or anchovy or things like that. They're going to pick up all sorts of different things on the reef that they come into contact with. So different there in that way too. Another way that they're unique is they actually don't have a specific breeding season. So you can have a Hawaiian monk seal pup born pretty much any time of the year. because the environment here is so stable. So they're not battling any kind of spring, summer, winter temperatures. It's just warm all year round. So they can have a pup any time of the year. That being said, it's generally concentrated in a window of roughly like February to June, but you still see pups born throughout the year across the archipelago. So that's definitely unique compared to a lot of other phosid species where they're really targeting that spring, summer period because those temperatures are warming up. That's when more food's going to be available, and they have that bulking up period before the winter arrives for those pups to really learn how to forage and gain some weight.
Wow, totally fascinating. I had no idea. That's amazing. And then do they have that similar life or the pregnancy? Are they pregnant for do they have delayed implantation and the like, or do they?
Very similar to other phocids like that. Gestation period, similar as well, 10 to 11 months. I had a slide on that, and I think I must have just clicked through it by accident. I'm sorry about that. I can see if I can go back and find it.
No, I mean,
but yeah.
That's interesting. And then the deep diving of the elephant seal and the ability to hold their breath longer than an hour and dive deeper than 1,000. These are diving more shallow dives, and they're probably not holding their breath for as long.
Correct. Yeah. So because they're diving on a reef, that most of their prey species are going to be in shallower waters, like above 30, 35 feet even. Because of this environment and how they've evolved along this archipelago, they haven't had to evolve to be able to dive deeply and find those prey species that are down at depths. So they're really concentrating in shallower waters around the islands, and that's where they're foraging primarily. So they didn't have to really develop that deep diving capability. So that's definitely a way they diverged from elephant seals.
Cool. Let's see, one other question. Question about the Toxoplasma effects. And can unmute. Go ahead, Andrew, if you want to chime in, ask your question. Yeah, there you go.
Trying to negotiate. How good is my audio?
I can hear you.
Great. My understanding about toxoplasmosis is that, it does sound like it would be coming through the feral cats, but it's also associated with like risky behavior, because when it infects a rat, particularly, they all of a sudden find cat urine more attractive than repulsive. And I think in even human infections with toxoplasmosis, they see an increase of risky behavior. Do you see that in the Hawaiian monk seals? And could you, because it's like, do they not avoid sharks more or something like that, which would be hard to figure out, because basically if they lose on that bet, you're not going to find anything to study.
Yeah, that's a good question, Andrew. And that risky behavior is one of those adaptations that Parasite has kind of created in those intermediate rodent hosts to make them less fearful of cats, so that
It's
they're more
dialed in. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating like life cycle that they've managed to like co-evolve with that intermediate host of those rodent species. I hadn't heard about humans, so I'm less familiar with humans doing riskier behavior.
There's a Robert Sapolsky anecdote about motorcycle accidents and organ harvesting. And the older physician said, look, to the younger physician says, look, check out these motorcycle patients, because they seem to be infected more often than the regular public with toxoplasmosis. So be sure to check those out before you go taking a liver or something like that. And I can send you a link if I have your email address, and I can point that out for you.
I'd be super curious to see it.
If they can post that, I just need a link on it. And then because it would seem to me that, kind of like as COVID-19 is kind of dialed in on deer and dogs and humans, I'm wondering if, toxo basically gets over to the monk seals, and basically whenever you have a feral cat population, you're going to have this risk.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's possible. With the monk seals specifically, because they haven't co-evolved with that parasite, it actually causes such severe disease that there's almost no time, or at least what we've observed so far is that they seem to come into contact with that parasite and then they go from relatively healthy to very sick to dying within a few days even. So the disease progression is very quick and severe. Like it's an acute disease in general from what we know so far.
Okay.
That being said, we can't necessarily sample every monk seal to see which ones have been exposed or have like an underlying infection that hasn't caused that level of disease. So that's a hole in our knowledge for sure. And then we had 2 monk seals that have been in our care specifically at our hospital that have survived for about 6 weeks of care, but both ended up unfortunately passing despite really aggressive therapy. So we weren't able to treat it. And we couldn't tell you, if there was any increase in risky behavior because it wasn't a normal setting. We weren't able to observe them out in the wild and how they were tolerating that disease. So they weren't tolerating that disease well enough to be able to survive on their own. We brought them in and then tried to treat it. And unfortunately, we were not successful. So something that we're looking at trying to adjust that protocol and have a greater chance of success, but it is a really severe systemic disease in Hawaiian monk seals.
Is your email available through the Marine Mammal Center?
I'm not actually sure if it's on the website.
Actually,
Okay, I'll try and find it.
yeah, we'll have it. Yeah, it might still be on the Marine Mammal Center, but we'll have Trey pop it up in there for you, or Wendy can put it in there. And then I have one other question from Sue Coulter. If you want to chime in, I know Sophie was talking a little bit about the fisheries interactions and things. Do you want to ask that question, Sue, yourself, or do you want me to read it?
I was just curious because I know that we have our own issue with California sea lions getting shot by people. So I was just curious if you dealt with locals for their own reasoning, not getting the importance of these animals and I'm not assuming it's locals, but yeah. Anyways, I was just curious if you dealt with that issue as well over there.
Yeah, and Sue joined a little late, which is what I think she missed that intro.
Exactly. That's why I said, I'm sorry if I'm already asking.
Oh, no, you're fine. Happy to revisit. And it's certainly a difficult situation. And there's been intentional killings of monk seals. And in the last year or two, it seems there's been a bit of an increase. And it's usually on a specific island or potentially a specific community, or at least we think that's what it is. We're fortunate here on the Big Island, we don't have that issue. Intentional killing isn't really a part of what we see causing mortality for monk seals here, sorry.
Cool, thank you. I just was curious.
Yeah, and then Sophie, we'll let you get back. I know one comment here was that this little monk seal that is in the picture looks like he's smiling. So they've got the cutest faces. So we'll get back.
Very adorable and very wrinkly. You can tell he's quite underweight. This is not what a healthy monk seal pup should look like. So this is an example of in general, what the hospital was built for is looking at that poor juvenile survivorship. And that's kind of what we call a typical patient, though that typical patient description is changing a little bit over the last couple of years, especially as we've taken on more animals from the main Hawaiian Islands with different disease concerns like toxoplasmosis or fisheries interactions. So it can be anything, but certainly a majority of our patients have been these underweight pups and yearlings. And this is another example of one of those individuals. So you can tell very, very thin here. This is Mea Ola, and she was actually a subadult that was rescued from Turn Island, so in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Can you still hear me if I talk with the plane going over?
Yeah, Sophie, we can hear you.
Roughly, okay.
Yeah, but feel free to pause and mute or whatever you need to do. We can look at the pretty pictures while planes are flying by.
Well, she certainly doesn't look the prettiest in this photo. But again, looking at that overall poor body condition. And these seals get rescued through the Hawaiian Monk Seal Research Program specifically. So those field camps that I mentioned before, when they're up, they go up by ship, and they can identify these potential rehabilitation patients and actually pick them up, and they travel on the ship for about a week and come here to Keikaula and then spend several months, and then they can go back up on the next research cruise to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So part of our rehabilitation always involves, when we do release those animals, is releasing them at the site where they were rescued. There's a few exceptions to that rule if there's a logistical reason, or it's a particular individual that is potentially at risk for human interactions or things like that. But in general, we always release where those animals were rescued from. And this is Mea'ola. So it's just an example of the radical transformation that can occur with just a few herring. So this was the goal. You know, she was otherwise healthy. All animals that come into the hospital get a full physical exam. They get blood work. You know, we do as thorough an evaluation as we can without it being invasive, of course. It's all, you know, just normal diagnostics that any one of us would have in an annual exam. But we do those, and she, other than having a parasite load, which is pretty normal for any wild animals to be carrying parasite friends, but in these specific animals that are so thin, those parasites can actually start competing with resources. So that is something that we'll treat for when they come in. And other than that, for the most part, it's just groceries and time, and then we can release them in much more robust condition and give them that opportunity to be just a bit more physically fit and able to compete in those Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. This was one of our most recent patients that also came from the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So another example, this is a leu, which means bright and active, which absolutely fit her personality. She's a very curious young seal. And she came to us during the pandemic, and she was kind of our miracle animal, where all the stars aligned, because they just happened to have U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff out there that were familiar with the monk seal program and the rehabilitation program, and they actually spotted her in underweight condition, but not emaciated. So certainly not like the picture of Mea'ola. You can tell this is her the day that she was rescued. So she's not as thin as some of the other individuals that we showed before. But he spotted her that she had just weaned, and he knew she was underweight, and probably had a very limited chance of surviving to year one. And there's a lot of data to support that. They've been able to look at those animals over time and their body conditions at weaning, and can correlate that with girth size and their chance of survival to the first year of life. So he was actually able to get hands on her, tag her, do some basic measurements, and determine that she was quite small and unlikely to survive to the first year of life. So the problem was, though, she was out on Midway in the middle of a pandemic, and there were very limited transportation options, but we were able to work closely with the Coast Guard, who can fly some of these animals back and forth. And because there's an airport on Midway, we were able to take this Coast Guard plane up to rescue her specifically at a time where it normally wouldn't have necessarily happened, because you wouldn't have had the staff or personnel there to spot this animal. So she came to us very similarly to Mea'ola for groceries and a little time. And she did really, really well in care. She's very bright and active and curious too. And this bottom picture on the right is not a leu. It's several other individuals that were in our care. But one of the things that we focus on specifically, because we have these young animals coming in, they're at this important life stage where they're really curious, they're exploring their environment, they're learning to forage on a whole bunch of different things. And then we're putting them into this sterile pool with no, beautiful coral reef with all of the stimulation that you would normally get there. One of the things we focus heavily on in our animal care programs is enrichment. So providing them with different items to be able to try to mimic some of those natural foraging behaviors. So we have some that are specifically designed. This one is pretty low tech. It's just a milk crate. And then you can stuff some of those fish and put it in different areas, put them into the pool. So they have to work a little bit and problem solve to be able to get some of those food items. So it's not just tossing in the herring every day at 3 particular times and just training them that it's easy, not training them, we don't train them, but teaching them that it's easy to just have their food tossed over. We want them to be engaging in things in their environment and to be doing some of those problem solving activities too. Sure, I'll pause for a sec. So this was another one of our pandemic patients. So he came to us also in 2021. This is RK58. And he was actually rescued from Kauai Island. This was a male juvenile Hawaiian monk seal. If you can appreciate, he's got some wounds on the side of his face. And if you look at this picture on the left-hand side specifically, you can see this big bulge or swelling on the right side of his face and neck. And what had happened with him is we actually believe this was a dog bite incident. So there was a report about a month before he showed up looking like this in thin condition with these swellings and obvious drainage of these wounds. There was a dog attack on monk seals reported to the monk seal hotline on Kauai Island. So we did receive reports, and the wounds that he had were consistent with dog bite wounds. So he was rescued for evaluation and care. And so this particular animal got antibiotics and some, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead on my slide. So again, these wounds were infected, so we can see this created an abscess. Dog bite wounds can be pretty dirty wounds and bring bacteria that monk seals aren't necessarily familiar with. So he definitely developed some abscess, and then over 3 or 4 weeks, that's when he officially stranded and looked in pretty poor condition. And think he just lost some weight because of that, because he was dealing with this overall infection. But the good news was he did really well in care too. So he responded very well to antibiotics. And just, again, a little bit of groceries. He wasn't as keen on our dead herring, which is normal for older individuals when they come into rehabilitation. They're used to foraging on a reef with a whole bunch of different options, and they don't always transition over to eating the herring that we are willing to offer them. So we do offer a variety of other live prey items when we can find them. We just don't always have them as consistently as the herring. So he still looks a little bit thin on his release, but because he came in for dog bite wounds, we treated the infection. He was cleared from that. We didn't have concerns about his survival long term. He just needed to be back out in his normal environment to be able to forage on the things that he wanted to eat instead of our herring. So yes, he did really well. And we, at the time, this case really brought up how important it is to continue those education and outreach efforts and really remind people to keep their dogs on a leash and obey appropriate wildlife signage when it's up, because this was something that could have been prevented if those dogs had just been on a leash. They'd known there was a monk seal in the area, and just preventing that interaction from happening.
Wow, that just gives me such a one question that came up in the chat is you tag them, and you can see in this picture that there's that orange flipper tag on the rear flipper, which would be true of our phocids. If it went to the mammal center, it would have that rear flipper tag for phocids, and on sea lions and otarides, you'd look for it in the pit. But there's your answer there. And then talking about that in the field work that volunteers can do, because when you volunteer for an organization like the Marine Mammal Center or the Hawaiian Monk Seal Hospital, you think you might want to be able to be in touch with the animals, but ever important is the work of community, talking about the risks and dangers and why the sign is up saying to keep your dog on a leash, and even just the natural history of, when we get an elephant seal up here that's molting, it's a great opportunity to kind of think that along those lines. You could go out and hang out and talk to the public and tell them what they're seeing. And that model, I'd love to see more of that kind of in the Fort Bragg area, because we have so few animals that we rescue every year. And it seems like a really just a great model to follow in terms of outreach to the public and give people more engagement, right?
Yeah, it's so important. I'm so glad that you brought that up. Like, it's just, right, sometimes I feel like it doesn't seem like the glamorous or exciting thing, but it's so critical to that conservation effort. Especially, this is the perfect example of where it could have been prevented, and how important getting that message out and just continuing to talk to people, you know, to keep your dog on a leash. That is, it's a simple thing that we can all do to make sure to help protect these particular species. So. And then our most recent patient, just a couple of weeks ago, came to us from the island of Oahu. So this was another juvenile male who actually didn't have a whole lot of history. So a lot of the individuals in the Hawaiian Islands are pretty well known, especially the main Hawaiian Islands. So we'll see regular sightings, regular information. But this is a male that was probably born in 2020, a COVID baby. So somewhere between 1 year and 2 years of age, and didn't actually get tagged. They tried very hard to tag every pup that's born in the main Hawaiian Islands, as well as many as they can in the Hawaiian Archipelago when those field teams are out there. But every once in a while, you can't reach one. And this was one of those animals. So we didn't have a whole lot of history on him. And then he showed up on Oahu with suspected fishing gear. So you can see hanging from the left side of his mouth here is what's called a pigtail swivel. I don't know if anybody of you are fishermen in the audience. I'm not as familiar with fishing gear, so this is certainly something I'm learning, but this is a swivel, and that's usually attached to some other wire leader or line that's attached to a hook. So when you see this hanging from the mouth like that, the suspicion is that there's a hook that's further down on a line somewhere in the GI tract. So he's stranded on Oahu, was photographed with this, and then it took a few days to be able to, for him to haul out in the right location with a team that was prepared to be able to go out and rescue him, but they were able to catch him January 28th, actually, and fly him over here to Keikaiola for assessment and care. So once he arrived, we were able to confirm on this left-hand side picture here, that's a radiograph. And you can see the spine running down the middle here. The head is at the top of the picture with his chest down at the bottom, and those are his shoulder blades on either side. So we were able to show this hook. You can see this barbed circle hook. It's about midway down the esophagus. So confirmed ingested fishing gear. And our response was then to conduct an endoscopy and to try to remove that gear. So this picture in the middle is a photograph from the endoscopy camera that's showing that hook, and it's actually embedded into the esophageal tissue. And fortunately, we have a special set of tools here that was specifically designed to be able to help us dehook these animals and get this gear out. And his was a fairly simple, I feel like you got to knock on wood when you say things like that, but his, the hook was dislodged pretty straight in a straightforward way. It caused minimal trauma, which was exactly what we were hoping for. We were able to remove that gear without too much fuss. That's a picture of the entirety of the gear there. So a pretty serious hook, but we were able to get him back out the door just a week later. With these fishing gear ingestions, it's ideal if you can release them relatively quickly and not have them spend a whole lot of time in care if they don't otherwise need it. He was otherwise healthy. He was a little on the thin side, but that's pretty typical for a juvenile male or a young male of this age. They tend to be thin as they're going through that rapid growth phase and learning to forage on different items. So that it feels strange since we usually want to boost those animals up and get them out the door in a really robust body condition. But for him, because he had already kind of become familiar with fishing gear, we already had this one fisheries interaction, we didn't want there to be any further risk of him habituating to people and associating people with food. So we got him dehooked and then sent him back out the door within just a matter of days. And then I wanted to put this information up there. It doesn't necessarily apply to all of you when you're in California, but certainly if you're out here, in Hawaii Island you see a monk seal, we want to hear about it. Every monk seal sighting is helpful, and it helps us build a database. Like, we build these histories on these animals, and then if we do have one that gets sick, then we have information on that individual and what they've looked like and what their body condition looks like, and any scars or wounds they've had in the past that can help inform us about that animal in particular. So all of that sighting information is actually really helpful, and we certainly encourage anybody, if you're out here or if you know somebody that's coming out and they see a monk seal, definitely get them to give us a call. And all of this information is also on the website too. If you just go to marinemammalcenter.org. And I don't have to tell you guys to give seals space. I think this community is well aware of that, but we always like to just make sure to put that on our slide, and as a general reminder for all of us, just to remember to stay 50 feet away, give them that space, and keep dogs on a leash is one of those messages we're trying to make sure gets out there.
I've had people question the 50 feet or 150 feet or get caught up on that. How many feet away? Well, I'm only, but right. I love the idea of, if it's noticing you and looking at you, yeah. It's a wild animal that is now nervous of your presence. So if it's seeing you and noticing you, you're probably too close, even if you're 63 feet away. If you're making it nervous, you're probably too close. So, focus on the distance as something, but also watch the animal's reaction to you and don't go any closer. If you're 100 feet away from a mama harbor seal and her pup and she's getting nervous, don't worry about the feet, worry about where you are in relation to that animal and stay back. And dogs, of course, are mistaken as predators, so that of course makes them nervous. And the harbor seals for our area and the California coast, and we're coming up in a couple months, we're going to have the pups and some early pups already, so time to practice it's a nice refresher. So I'm glad you put that up there. And I know plenty of our audience, they do go to Hawaii and they come back and they say, look, I saw a Hawaiian monk seal. And so it's nice. We do, you're just over the pond, so to speak.
Absolutely. Take pictures, send them to us, and 100% agree. If that seal is bothered by your presence, is noticing you, then you're just too close. So don't get caught up on the number. And you guys know us, so I won't stress about that, but that's the website. If you want more information on Hawaii too, it's up there too. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to, even if I can't really see you, I think it's safe with this few people that if you want to unmute. I see that Sue is giving the clever little hand clap, and thank you so much, Sophie. And feel free to ask questions. And this website, the marinemammalcenter.org, I go there often. And if you ever want to know anything about any marine mammal, click on that website and surf through scientific papers, surf through about each animal, patient stories, science. It's an incredible website to look at, and I visit it frequently. Was going there immediately this morning because we had such an amazing patient come up in Fort Bragg yesterday that I don't even know, Sophie, maybe you can answer this. Has the Marine Mammal Center ever had a adult female Guadalupe fur seal in their care?
Very occasionally.
Okay.
It's rare. I think there's less than 5 in the history, I think. Something like that. So not very many at all.
Wow. I mean, I know we have the pups, and our little chicory that was rescued on Fort Bragg Beach or Mendocino Beach had an eye issue, and she is now down at SeaWorld as an ambassador animal.
Yeah.
Chicory, she's an ambassador animal down at SeaWorld. So
yep.
Yeah. I see you've got lots of questions in the chat, and I will I see thank you, and thank you for stories and information, and thank you, Sophie.
You're all most welcome.
Yeah,
Lovely to be here.
Gratitude your way, Sophie. Thanks for taking
you.
the time in your sunny afternoon.
Yeah,
How do their four flippers compare to a northern elephant seal?
Pretty similar, like very similar in structure and function, but they're, I think, a little bit more tactile in some ways
Uh-huh.
in using those flippers, but generally pretty similar.
It's so cool. If you ever see an elephant seal on one of our beaches and watch them maneuver those flippers, and like you think of a flipper as a flipper, and because we have so many skeletons, you can see that there's all these bones in there. But if you watch an elephant seal scratch, or even a harbor seal, you can really see the finger bones underneath the flippery part. And it's just so cool to watch. And that how they maneuver them. And yeah, it's pretty cool to see.
Absolutely. The monk seals, they don't, when we have to restrain them for tube feeding, unlike their elephant seal cousins, they tend to roll over on their backs and they bring their flippers up and they're trying to smack you away with the towel, smack it out of the way. They're actually really crafty at being able to grab that towel with a flipper and just go whoosh and just flip it right off them. It's pretty amazing.
Interesting. Flipping over, where the elephant seals, when you're trying to tube feed them, they'll slap you in the back of the head with a poopy flipper.
Yeah. These guys use their front flippers to their advantage.
Totally. Any other questions there, folks? Oh, do they flip sand like the elephant seals?
Don't actually.
Interesting.
No, they're just chilling on the beach. They look so relaxed.
Of course. They're Hawaiian. So thanks, everybody. Thanks again for being here. And thank you, Sophie. And
Oh,
we hope
great
you
evening.
will say aloha and enjoy the Hawaiian sunshine as we shiver in our boots.
Yeah. Come to Hawaii.